June 6th of 1944. The beaches of Normandy become the stage of the greatest military landing in history. More than 150,000 men crossed the English Channel to face Hitler's wall. What happened that day changed the destiny of the world and marked forever those who were there. The restrained roar, preparation under the strictest secrecy. The spring of 1944 transformed the south of England into a living organism, into a monster that breathed in silence, crouched in front of the English Channel. From Cornwall to Kent, the roads, the villages, the fields, the hangars and the factories became pieces of a colossal mechanism that moved without announcing itself. Under a net of artificial fog, camouflage and forced silence, the Allies prepared what Admiral Bertram Ramsay had called, without exaggeration, the greatest amphibious operation of all time. More than 1.5 million American soldiers were already on British soil. The Canadians had arrived by the thousands. The British divisions, hardened by the Desert War and the withdrawals from the continent, were scattered, waiting for orders. The civilian population adapted to a new landscape. Columns of jeeps at every crossing, tanks covered with tarps at every corner, and helmets with foreign insignias in every tavern. The British authorities began to call the zones taken by the Americans occupied England. In Devon and Dorset, an Englishman could travel for entire days without seeing another uniform that was not from the infantry of Iowa, the military police of Texas, or the engineer corps of New York. There were improvised shops on every corner, hangars where once there were barns, field hospitals where once there were churches. The southern beaches from Slapton Sands to Bracklesham Bay filled with men rehearsing landings under the simulated fire of naval artillery. The training was relentless. The slightest mistake, a delay in the descent, a failure in the ignition of a motor, could doom an entire company to death on the French coast. No one spoke of D-Day by its name. The term overlord floated like a code between folds, but even that was limited to the highest levels of command. The soldiers knew that something big was approaching, that this something could end their lives, but also the war. The secrecy was absolute. Every classified document carried marks that prevented its reproduction. On the docks of Southampton, intelligence officers made each sailor and each stevedore pass through 2 control filters. No one could write letters without censorship. No one could say aloud to which beach they were going, if they even knew. The slightest slip, a canteen chat, a wrongly sent letter, could reveal the location, the date, or the objective of the operation. A poorly packed package with confidential papers sent by mistake to an address in Chicago reached unauthorized hands and triggered the alarm at SHAEF. Eisenhower had to review the levels of confidentiality after the incident. While the soldiers trained, the planners fine-tuned an unprecedented logistical symphony. 2 artificial ports called Mulberries were being built, which would be towed and assembled in front of the Norman beaches. The sea had to become a port. Floating roads, mobile pontoons, breakwaters with old ships deliberately sunk were designed. Each piece was manufactured as if it were a unique masterpiece. Tons of concrete, steel, cables and generators were moved in conditions of total discretion. A step away from the channel, thousands of workers labored in darkness, with black curtains and without fully knowing what purpose what they built served. The roads began to fill with endless columns, tankers, tank transports, cranes, gasoline trucks, mobile kitchens, medical units. Every night the headlights were covered, the lights turned off, and the trucks advanced along routes marked only with signals visible from cabins painted with fluorescent substances. The convoys were so numerous that many villages were completely isolated from the outside world. The railway stations were closed. The mail became sporadic. Beginning in April, any civilian who wanted to approach the coast had to present a written justification, sealed, authorized. No one was to see what was happening there. In the camps, the days became repetitive, running, loading, shooting, cleaning, the paratroopers made night jumps, the pilots rehearsed formation flights until exhaustion. The combat units immersed themselves in simulations where French villages were recreated with fictitious names. A false currency with francs had even been printed to give to the soldiers. The level of detail was obsessive, from the resistance of the bridges to the texture of the sand. The previous days, however, brought an invisible enemy, the weather. A low-pressure front was approaching from the Atlantic. The waves rose, the wind turned. The initial date, the 5th of June, was discarded. Eisenhower gathered his team at Southwick House. In a room with maps that covered entire walls, he listened to meteorologist Stagg say that there was a possible brief window of good weather for Tuesday the 6th. Ike smoked in silence. He had to decide whether to send 500,000 men to the other side or to risk weeks of preparation and halted morale. At 4:15, after a sleepless night, he said what would mark history. "Okay, let's go." Meanwhile, on the other side, the Germans were grappling with their own uncertainties. Rommel was on leave in Germany. Rundstedt trusted that the landing would be farther north in the Pas-de-Calais. The rains had made them believe there was no risk of immediate invasion. Many officers were not at their posts. The Wehrmacht was carrying out a war game on the morning of the 6th of June. No one expected the Allies to choose that day. At 23:30 on the 5th of June in the British bases, the last hot meal was served to thousands of men. On the decks of the assault ships, officers handed letters to their men, often handwritten. Some soldiers put medals, holy cards, or a family photo in their inner pocket. On the deck of the Empire Crossbow, a Welsh sailor complained. He had not wanted to have the V of volunteer in his booklet, but accepted when they offered him cigarettes and a bottle of beer. The hatches of the ships closed. In the hangars, the engines of the C-47 began to roar. In the artillery bases, the cannons pointed to the French coast. In the command center, an American general crossed himself in silence, and the south of England, which for months had held its breath, finally let it out. The weight of the sky, bombings and sabotage before the landing. Before the first Allied soldier set foot on the sand of Normandy, long before the paratroopers jumped in the night of the 5th of June, the battle for France had already begun in the sky. During the first months of 1944, a series of preparatory aerial operations unfolded with increasing intensity over Western Europe. Under the direction of the British Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force of the United States, thousands of bombers took off each night bound for the continent, not to attack cities but to systematically tear apart the German infrastructure that sustained the occupation. The objective was not only military, it was psychological. The railways had to become unusable, the fuel depots had to burn. The coastal batteries had to be left deaf and the enemy troops confused. The real landing would be fought on the sand, but success or failure would be born among the clouds. From January, the pace of the bombings became daily, in full light or in darkness. Train after train of B-17, Lancaster, Halifax, and Liberator bombers crossed the skies in formations so dense that people on the ground thought it was a storm. Inside, the crew members, mostly young, smoked in silence or prayed, each one with an oxygen mask, a pair of gloves, and a racing heart. When the bomb bay doors opened, the roar of the bombs interrupted the constant hum of the engines. The first explosions were not seen, but they were felt, as if the entire continent were creaking. The plan was clear, sow confusion. Each destroyed bridge would slow down the arrival of German reinforcements on the day of the landing. Each bombed station would prevent the resupply of munitions. Each interrupted railway line would force the Wehrmacht to improvise. The code name was Transportation Plan, and its architect was Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. He was not interested in destroying Paris or Berlin. He wanted to tear apart the logistical skeleton that supported the Atlantic front. To achieve it, between March and June of 1944, more than 75,000 tons of bombs were dropped on 33 strategic railway centers. The cities of Caen, Saint-Lô, Rouen, Lisieux, Le Mans, Argentan, Amiens, and many others became priority targets. They were not isolated objectives. Each one was connected to the arteries that linked Normandy with the rest of France and Germany. When night fell, the inhabitants already knew what was coming. A distant whistle, then a tremor, afterward an orange glow on the horizon. Sometimes the bombings lasted only minutes. Other times half an hour. Hospitals prepared as best they could. Roofs collapsed, rails bent, bridges disintegrated in the air. Accompanying from the shadows, silent but lethal, acted the resistance. They were scattered, poorly armed groups who knew every crossing, every shed, every warehouse in the French interior. They had clear orders from London: interrupt the railway network in at least 500 key points during the days prior to the invasion, destroy communication cables, sabotage locomotives, place explosives in tunnels and viaducts. Many of these partisans had waited years to act. Now, at last, the war also reached their hands. A single well-executed cut could delay a panzer division by 2 days. A stopped train meant fewer troops facing the beach. Each night, a maquisard crawling among rails was worth more than 100 bombs. In parallel, British and American commandos of the SAS and OSS launched missions behind enemy lines, sometimes to train resistance groups, other times to eliminate specific objectives. Some blew up stations, others control towers. Few survived more than 1 week, but all knew that those days could change the direction of history. Allied intelligence fed the campaign with surgical precision. Aerial photographs revealed the position of armored trains, switching yards, camouflaged arsenals, alternative routes. From bunkers in London and headquarters in High Wycombe, analysts studied each image. In less than 48 hours, a new objective could already be on the priority list for the next squadron. But the sky also had its risks. The night missions over France were not immune. The Luftwaffe maintained squadrons of night fighters. On the ground, the anti-aircraft batteries fiercely defended each railway crossing. Many B-17 never returned. Many Halifax were last seen crossing the Seine wrapped in smoke. The crews knew that the loss rate was high, but each flight was another piece of the domino. Each bomb dropped was one less wall for the day when the Higgins and LCM ramps would open. In southern England, the pilots received their instructions only a few hours in advance. Sometimes they didn't even know the name of the city they were going to attack. Only coordinates, heading, and altitude. In the cockpit, a map, a compass, a watch, and an aerial photograph were all they had. Routine became religion: engine, takeoff, formation, climb, heading, load, descent, evasion, return. There was no room for improvisation. From the ground, the soldiers waiting for the landing looked at the sky. They listened to the growing hum of hundreds of engines and knew that that night another French city would be left in darkness. Some prayed for the pilots, others envied their action. All understood that those steel-covered clouds were the first line of the front. On the 3rd of June, only 3 days before the landing, a massive aerial offensive fell on northwestern France. More than 1,000 Allied bombers took off toward the region of Normandy. In just a few hours, the selected objectives were devastated: stations, roads, ammunition depots. Meanwhile, French commandos blew up rails between Le Mans and Tours. That night, a train loaded with tanks bound for Caen never reached its destination. By the night of the 5th of June, chaos was almost complete. The Germans had lost communication between several sectors. The telephone lines were cut. The division chiefs did not know if reinforcements would arrive in time. Some generals began to doubt their own logistical map. Troops moved slowly along secondary roads. Tanks were stranded on destroyed viaducts. In the stations of Rennes, Chartres, and Argentan, columns of black smoke replaced orders. The Wehrmacht still did not know that this paralysis had been designed. At 2200 hours on the 5th of June, while the first assault boats lined up off the coast, Allied aviation launched a final wave of attacks. This time they were not warehouses or bridges. This time they were coastal batteries. The idea was not to destroy them, but to deafen them, to disconcert them, to make them fail at the first shot. At 2300 hours, the Luftwaffe remained inactive. It believed, mistakenly, that the bad weather would prevent any offensive. The sky was clear. The moon shone over the channel, and from the east, the echoes of the engines returning to their bases could still be heard. The sky had already done its work. Go! The instant the channel was crossed, the 5th of June of 1944 began as a dense wait. The sky over the south of England was overcast, with gusts of wind shaking the hangars and making the tarps that covered the tanks creak. The bad weather had forced the operation to be postponed 24 hours. A meteorological window seemed to open, but no one knew it for certain. At Southwick House, near Portsmouth, the main Allied commanders gathered once more in a room where maps covered the walls and clocks seemed to slow down. At 4:15 in the morning, Dwight Eisenhower looked at Captain Stagg, his meteorologist, and heard a phrase that had already become a mantra. "There are no guarantees, sir, but the morning of the 6th seems less hostile than the previous one." Eisenhower nodded. He walked to the window, took a last drag of his cigar, and spoke softly, almost to himself. "Okay, let's go." At that moment, a million gears began to move. From Cornwall to Kent, the sealed camps activated. Thousands of soldiers, who until then had eaten, slept, trained, and waited in the most absolute isolation, began to march toward the embarkation points. The orders were delivered in sealed envelopes. The unit insignias were covered with tape. The weapons checked one last time. In each port from Falmouth to Tilbury, a coded language filled the loudspeakers. Embark phase red, code Romeo. It was the definitive signal. The men knew, without anyone saying it, that the moment had come. Some shaved unnecessarily, as if routine could calm fear. Others wrote hurried letters. Hidden bottles of cognac were opened. Some prayed, some sang. Others closed in on themselves and looked at the ground as if the future could be read there. On the decks of the assault ships, the engines were already running. LCTS, LSTS, LCMS, and every imaginable variety of naval transport began to line up in columns that seemed endless. More than 5,000 vessels of all sizes and functions would form the largest naval force ever assembled. From escort destroyers to tugs of artificial ports, from heavy cruisers to simple barges filled with fuel drums, the English Channel, so feared, so watched, was becoming a living highway. Some soldiers did not know their destination until that moment. Others had trained for months with models of the beaches they were now going to tread. On a Canadian ship, Lieutenant Roy Cairns gathered his men in the troop hold, unrolled a map and said, "Boys, this is Juno Beach. We are going to make history or die in it." The first to depart were the airborne divisions. Around 2,200 on the 5th of June, the C-47 began to warm up their engines at the bases of Upottery, Exeter, Greenham Common and North Witham. The runways vibrated with the deep roar of the Pratt and Whitney engines. On board, the men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Division of the 6th British Airborne were loaded with parachutes, ammunition, radios, explosives, and fear. The doors closed with definitive creaks. Each man received a blessing, a ration pack, a good luck kiss in the case of the British, who carried the custom of the send-off. Some carried letters taped to their chest, others photos of their children tucked inside their helmet. At 23:30 the planes began to take off in waves, one after another, wings crossing the night with position lights turned off and a single order: jump when you see the green light. The darkness over Normandy filled with gliders. The Horsa and Hamilcar, loaded with men and equipment, flew silently toward critical points, bridges over the Orne, crossroads in the Sainte-Mère-Église area, fields behind the beaches. Some fell in the exact place. Others were dragged by the wind and landed in flooded, scattered, muddy areas. The paratroopers, once on the ground, fought not only against the Germans, but against total disorientation. Meanwhile, at sea, the first naval formations began to leave the British coasts. The channel filled with crossing wakes, with orders transmitted by light signals, with columns of smoke, with shouts cast into the wind. The sailors knew they carried on their decks the men who would open Europe, that what was at stake was not a battle, but a continent. In Southampton Bay, the captain of an LST observed through binoculars how other ships moved away one by one without fanfare, without farewells. Only the constant roar of diesel engines set the rhythm. On a Tribal-class destroyer, the signal officer checked the codes one last time. In each landing craft, the British Marines, the American infantrymen, the French commandos, and the Canadians waited in position. Aboard the USS Augusta, Eisenhower was silent. He had no more orders to give, he could only wait. He knew that at that moment hundreds of men were already floating over the channel, that just as many were already falling behind enemy lines, that the enemy still knew nothing, that if luck was with them, France would awaken to a new front. At 200 hours on the 6th of June, the sea was covered with vessels in 5 columns, each heading for a beach with a code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The moonlight revealed the silhouette of the largest ships. The tugs dragged the artificial ports. The minesweepers advanced at the front, clearing the passages marked with phosphorescent buoys. The current of the channel was strong but not impossible. Each vessel followed a precise route. No one could deviate. A course error meant landing on the wrong beach under enemy fire. From land, the German observers saw confusing lights on the horizon, but mistook them for coastal patrols or maneuvers. Some reports reached the command, but were discarded. The German High Command still believed that the bad weather prevented any operation. Rommel was in Germany with his wife. Rundstedt was asleep. In his headquarters, only a handful of minor officers remained awake. At 300 hours, the first naval bombardments began. 152, 203, and 356 mm cannons opened fire from cruisers and battleships. The German batteries were the target of a rain of calculated fire. The explosions, visible from kilometers away, marked the awakening of Normandy. The houses trembled. The German soldiers ran toward the bunkers. The sentries then knew it was not a drill. It was the beginning. At 4:45 on the decks of the landing ships, the ramps began to lower. The engines of the assault boats started up. The waves were irregular. Some soldiers vomited from nervousness. Others could not stop looking at the horizon. From the towers of the ships, the officers shouted, "Allons-y! Let's go! Move!" The waterline advanced toward the coast. The promised land was covered in fog, in smoke, in fire. But it was getting closer. Each wave pushed them toward it. Europe was about to open, and no one could stop it now. The first on land, the paratroopers trapped in the swamp. The dawn of the 6th of June of 1944 was a living darkness. Under the vault of the Norman sky, cut only by the distant hum of the engines, a landscape of sleeping fields, calm canals, and silent forests unfolded. From the west, over the Cotentin Peninsula, came floating a threat that made no noise, but that would change the course of the war. They were the first men of the invasion. They were shadows with wings. At 0:15 hours, the skies of Normandy began to fill with twinkling dots like a swarm of organized fireflies. They were the C-47 Skytrain, the Dakota, the Sterling, the Albemarle. They flew in tight formation without navigation lights, crossing the English Channel in complete radio silence. Inside each fuselage, a living load of nerves and metal. The men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Division of the United States and the 6th British Airborne. Paratroopers, men trained to fall behind enemy lines, to disorient, to capture, to destroy, to resist. Each plane vibrated with the deep roar of the engine. The men sat on side benches, wedged in like pieces of a box. The wind slipped through the cracks. No one spoke. They only looked at their boots, clutched their backpacks, reviewed their equipment in their minds. They carried heavy loads, parachutes, weapons, ammunition, explosives, radios, and fear. All knew that what was coming resembled no training. The red light above the jump door was a beacon that stopped hearts. When the green turned on, they would have only seconds to leap into nothingness. Some did it with a shout, others in silence. The custom was to give a slap on the helmet to the next man in the line. A silent signal. It is your turn. But that night the sky was treacherous. The formations, carefully organized on the map, broke apart in the air. The wind had risen stronger than expected. The thick clouds hid the landmarks. The beacons launched by the pathfinders, the scouts before the jump, failed or fell in the wrong zones. The pilots of the C-47 under anti-aircraft fire maneuvered erratically. Many paratroopers jumped kilometers from the objective, some over towns full of enemy troops, others into fields flooded by the Germans as a defensive measure. To fall there was like throwing oneself into a well. The first to jump did so over Sainte-Mère-Église. In complete darkness, the American soldiers descended slowly over a town that was not sleeping. There was fire, a house burned, some paratroopers remained hanging from trees, others were shot down still in the air. The most famous soldier, John Steele, was left hanging from the steeple of the church, pretending to be dead while the Germans ignored him. Hours later, he would be taken prisoner. Further south, many landed in swampy terrain. German Marshal Rommel, foreseeing the invasion, had ordered the flooding of the low fields of Cotentin through the opening of sluice gates. Water covered entire stretches of pastures and rural paths. Those who fell there sank to their waists. The wet equipment became an anchor. Some drowned, trapped in their harnesses. Others managed to free themselves but lost their weapons. The mud swallowed radios, maps, explosives. An officer of the 101st was trapped by the leg and bled slowly. A comrade tried to drag him but also became trapped. They could only wait. No one came. The dispersion was total. Entire companies were divided into groups of 3, 4, 5 men without contact with their chain of command. There was no signal, there was no reference. The terrain was strange, the names of the villages were unpronounceable. Some soldiers wandered for hours in the midst of absolute silence, hearing in the distance isolated shots, muffled explosions, screams. They knew they were not alone, but they did not know where they were. In the eastern sector, the 6th British Airborne Division had the mission of capturing the bridge over the Orne in Bénouville, later to be known as Pegasus Bridge. A group of Horsa gliders landed only 50 meters from the objective in one of the most precise maneuvers in military history. Major John Howard and his men descended, took the bridge after a brief but fierce resistance, and held it until dawn. It was an exception. In most cases, the landing was chaos. At another point near Ranville, a British unit fell on a mined grove. The explosions lit up the night. The survivors had to crawl, wounded, to a farm where they remained hidden. One soldier had lost his boots, another his rifle. There were officers scratching their faces with fingernails full of mud, trying to understand the direction. Some oriented themselves by the shots, others by intuition. In the sector of the 82nd, the fighting began almost immediately. One of the main objectives was the bridge of La Fière over the Merderet River. To control it meant closing the passage to German reinforcements toward Omaha Beach. But the area was completely flooded. Entire units of the 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment fell into the water. Several men drowned. Those who managed to get out crawled to the edge of the causeway, where they fought for hours, surrounded by enemy fire, in the midst of a hell of mud and shrapnel. Sergeant Vincent J. Rogers of the 101st would remember years later having walked with water up to his chest with his carbine tied to his neck while he saw corpses floating in the gloom. Each step was a titanic effort, each shadow a possible ambush. The order was to regroup, but no one knew where the center was. The only clear thing was the instinct. Move, do not stay still. The night advanced, and with it the disorientation. There were no lines. There was no front. The paratroopers, scattered across the Norman countryside, fought in islands, in improvised skirmishes, in mutual ambushes. Sometimes they confused one another. They fired at other friendly units, believing they were Germans. The nerves were at the limit. A British soldier was killed by mistake by another platoon that confused him with an infiltrator. The passwords failed. The language was a barrier, fear, a thick cloud. But there were also moments of lucidity, of spontaneous coordination. Officers without troops took command of strangers. Isolated groups met in the forest and formed improvised platoons. Some used compasses. Others followed the sound of explosions to orient themselves toward the objectives, and against all odds, many missions were fulfilled. The key routes were cut, the bridges blown up, the German patrols ambushed. The confusion played in favor of both, but also revealed something more: the capacity of the paratroopers to adapt, improvise, and resist. At 500 hours, the sky was already lightening. From the east, naval artillery began to illuminate the horizon. On land, the first exhausted paratroopers prepared to face the new day. They did not know that they had just survived the darkest part of the operation. They did not know how many they were. They did not know how many were missing. But they were there, wet, dispersed, exhausted, but alive. Omaha Beach, the beach that swallowed the dawn. The darkness began to fade slowly, as if the sky refused to illuminate what was about to happen. It was the 6th of June of 1944, and the troop transports of the 5th American Corps, aboard violently pitching landing craft, advanced toward Omaha Beach. The men of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division and those of the 16th Regiment of the 1st Division were there, pressed against their backpacks in silence. The salty air mixed with the smoke of the naval shells that were already beginning to whistle over their heads filled their lungs. Some vomited from the swell, others recited prayers softly. No one spoke of anything other than the rifle they gripped between their legs, the face they wanted to see again, or the fear. They had rehearsed for weeks, but nothing could replicate the harshness of what they were about to face. When the ramps lowered, hell would begin. The sea, apparently calm from firm land, was in reality completely agitated. Many of the craft did not reach the beach where they should have. The strong currents diverted the boats hundreds of meters, and the soldiers disembarked in unknown sectors, without artillery support, without references. The units were torn apart before reaching combat. When the first barges touched the bottom, just past 6:30 in the morning, the Norman coast received the invaders with German fire that was dense, precise, and lethal. From the bunkers hidden among bushes reinforced with concrete, the MG-42 machine guns swept the beaches with 1,200 shots per minute. The boats opened their ramps, and the soldiers were cut down before taking a single step. The impact of the bullets ricocheted on helmets, pierced vests, bodies. Some fell into the water and died without leaving the barge. Others threw themselves into the sea from the sides, only to sink under the weight of their equipment or to be struck by the snipers in the waves. The tide was rising. The anti-tank mines and the iron crosses, placed strategically to prevent the passage of armored vehicles, became lethal traps. Many soldiers were trapped among the structures, dragged by the current or forced to climb them under enemy fire. There was no cover. The only refuge was a barely visible mound of sand or the inert body of a comrade. Captain Joe Dawson of the 16th Infantry tried to organize his men, but when he turned his head, they were no longer there. His unit had been reduced to less than half in minutes. The same happened with the demolition engineers who tried to open paths through the beach sown with traps. Their boats had been hit at sea or the explosives had been lost in the water. Barely a handful reached the coastal wall alive. The American naval fire, crucial to weaken the defenses, had been ineffective at Omaha. Most of the shells landed too far back or too far forward. The bomber planes, which should have left a trail of destruction over the defensive line, dropped their loads beyond the target for fear of hitting their own troops. The result was that the German positions remained intact. On the radios of the ships, fragmented reports were received. No progress. Heavy casualties. The beach is blocked. Some officers considered aborting the operation at Omaha. The chaos was absolute. The signals were confusing, the units mixed and communications cut. It was not known which regiment was still in combat and which had been annihilated. In the midst of that desolation, scattered groups began to advance through the few gaps that existed between the shots. A platoon of Company E managed to reach the breakwaters at the eastern end. They dug improvised trenches with their hands, crawled through bomb craters, and from there began to fire back. The beach was carpeted with bodies and abandoned equipment. Backpacks, helmets, straps, boots floated. Many wounded cried out for help, others bled out in silence. A war correspondent who landed with the first wave described the scene as a slaughterhouse of steel and blood. He tried to take photographs, but the camera filled with sand. In the next wave, a Catholic priest descended with his black robe waving in the wind with no protection other than a Bible. He was struck by a fragment while giving last rites to an 18-year-old boy. For hours, the only way to survive was to stay lying down. In the Dog Green sector, the bodies lay so close together that they formed a wall of inert flesh in front of the shore. The Germans fired without ceasing but began to worry about the persistence of the attack. The fog began to lift, revealing the silhouettes of destroyers that approached dangerously close to the coast. In a desperate act, the captains ordered direct bombardment of the enemy positions, even with Allied troops on the ground. By mid-morning, the following waves of infantry managed a small margin of progress. Sections of the 116th managed to climb the western cliffs, using grenades, bayonets, and shovels to eliminate the machine gun nests. In several cases, the soldiers improvised flamethrowers with fuel cans. The advance was hand-to-hand, meter by meter, on the edge of physical collapse. In the center of the beach, a German machine gun ran out of ammunition and was captured. The operator was lynched by soldiers whose unit had been completely destroyed. By midday, some platoons had managed to reach the line of dunes behind the beach, establishing the first penetration points. But the cost was colossal. More than 2,000 men were dead or gravely wounded. The sea continued to bring bodies to the shore. The sand had changed color. Even so, those who had managed to cross did not look back. They advanced in scattered groups, without officers, without orders, guided only by the instinct to survive and the desire not to have died in vain. Many didn't know if they were still at Omaha or if they had been diverted kilometers away by the currents. But they were in France, and that was enough. The beach swallowed the dawn. And during those first hours, no man who set foot on Omaha was ever the same again. Sword and Juno, chaos on the coastal avenues. The first minutes on Sword and Juno beaches were a parade of engines, smoke, and screams. The grey light of dawn barely outlined the silhouettes of the metal obstacles sown in the sand, the famous Czech hedgehogs, anti-tank crosses and wires. When the ramps of the landing craft infantry opened like iron jaws and the British and Canadian soldiers, Their faces covered in black grease and helmets tightened, advanced through the deafening noise of the naval bombardment. On Sword Beach, assigned to the 3rd British Division under General Rennie, the landing was scheduled for 07:25 hours. But nothing occurred as planned. The tide was lower than anticipated, which forced the men to run more than 300 meters under crossfire to reach the relative safety of the coastal wall. Many were killed before even touching solid ground. From the German bunkers, the machine gun nests of the 716th Infantry Regiment opened sweeping fire. The water turned red and the air was crossed by tracers like a swarm of wasps. The DD tanks, Shermans with floats meant to swim toward the beach, didn't all manage to arrive. Some sank when launched too far out, others became targets for 88mm cannons. But those that did arrive managed to open passages in the defences. A British officer recalled that one of the first tanks fired against a German mortar emplacement just as the ramp touched bottom, and that the shot set the occupants inside on fire. The smell of burnt flesh and cordite filled the air. A company of engineers dragged Bangalore torpedoes, explosive tubes designed to open breaches in barbed wire, while another group ran with mine detectors. The mix was explosive. Amid fire and chaos, the cables tangled, the detonators failed, and the anxiety increased with each lost minute. A platoon sheltered behind a destroyed tank while the commander shouted orders that no one heard. Only after several attempts did they manage to open a narrow way through which the riflemen began to advance. The Green Howards, a traditional unit from northern England, was one of the first to climb the dunes. Some fighters crawled through the gullies dug by bombs, others hid behind destroyed houses. The advance was slow. Each meter gained cost lives. In the eastern part of Sword, the Royal Marines found more organized resistance. Snipers in the windows of coastal villas, German soldiers using their own houses as trenches. One of the most unforeseen challenges was traffic. As tanks, jeeps, half-tracks and mechanical mules managed to land, they began to pile up on the narrow strip of sand. A truck driver described how he had to wait almost half an hour while an anti-tank gun blocked the way, unable to go back or forward, trapped in a bottleneck among bodies and the wrecks of smoking vehicles. A Churchill tank, its gun still smoking, literally pushed a stuck jeep to the side in order to advance inland. Further on, at Juno Beach, the story was no different. The Canadian landing, led by the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Rod Keller, faced some of the densest defences of the Atlantic Wall. At 07:45, when the main wave began, the sea was already infested with floating debris, sunken boats and corpses. The soldiers of the Regina Rifles and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles descended under a rain of projectiles. Despite the intense previous bombardments, many of the German bunkers remained intact. One, camouflaged among the rubble of a seaside boarding house, fired ceaselessly with its MG-42, cutting down a dozen men before a Canadian flamethrower reduced it. The testimonies of the sappers recount how some comrades exploded upon stepping on mines placed on the stairways to the houses. The beach itself was a natural trap. In some sectors, the coastal wall was only 50 meters from the water, which concentrated all the violence of German fire into a narrow corridor. A witness described how the noise was so intense that one didn't hear one's own screams, only felt how the boots sank into the sand and the chest vibrated with each explosion. A squadron of Sherman tanks, part of the Fort Garry Horse, managed to land among the waves. Some succeeded in advancing along the route to Bernières-sur-Mer. There, a stone bridge over the canal was mined. The first tank that crossed activated the charge. The explosion raised a cloud of black smoke, and when it cleared, there was no trace left of the armored vehicle nor of its crew. Despite everything, the Allied tide was beginning to overwhelm the defenses. The British commandos of No. 41 and No. 48, assigned to cut the Combayeux Road, advanced through the gardens of the beach houses, surprising the Germans from the flanks. In some houses, fighting was hand-to-hand, in hallways or staircases with bayonets, grenades and rifle butts. One of the most dramatic moments occurred when a Canadian machine gun, mounted on the balcony of a destroyed cafe, opened fire on a group of Germans who were trying to escape through the back street. A 19-year-old soldier, after emptying the entire ammunition belt, came down trembling through stairs covered in blood and plaster, his hands bloodied not by wounds, but by the vibration of the weapon. The immediate objective at Juno was to take Courseulles-sur-Mer, a small coastal town that served as a link point with the route toward Caen. The fighting extended for hours among the buildings. A German sniper, hidden in the bell tower, was finally killed by a tank shot. The impact shattered the bell tower and threw the rubble over a squad of sappers who were trying to set up a communications post. As they advanced inland, the Canadians found hidden bunkers, some completely intact, with Germans surrendering in tears, and others that offered desperate resistance. One position, defended by 6 men, resisted almost 2 hours until it was reduced by dynamite. By mid-morning, the situation was beginning to stabilize in some sectors. However, the Germans counterattacked from inland with self-propelled guns, and armored units were detected moving toward the front. The British commandos, who had advanced too far, were forced to entrench themselves in the middle of residential avenues with destroyed roofs and corpses on the sidewalks. A Canadian patrol found a French civilian family hiding in the basement of a partially destroyed hotel. The father, covered in dust, embraced his children while murmuring "Merci, merci" without stopping. Outside, the roar of battle continued. The day had barely begun, and yet on Sword and Juno the scenes of a total war had already accumulated. The maps, the orders, and the timetables became irrelevant. Chaos had its own logic. The British and Canadian officers knew that if Caen was not taken before nightfall, German reinforcements would arrive. The battle for control of the main road was about to begin, but for now, everything still burned by the sea. Gold Beach, swimming tanks, invisible resistances, and French farmers. The morning of the 6th of June of 1944, while the first rays of the sun filtered over the grey waters of the English Channel, the Allied fleet in front of Gold Beach stirred like a living and trembling machine. It was the turn of the 50th British Infantry Division, supported by a floating battery of Churchill tanks, Sherman DD, and units of engineers, sappers, medics, and observers. The Norman coast seemed calm, almost deserted, but that would not last. The first to enter real combat were not the infantry nor the tanks, but the German cannons. At 6:25, the enemy coastal artillery, embedded in bunkers camouflaged among the thickets and concrete structures, began to open fire. A burst of shells fell among the waves, just as the landing craft released their gates. The hidden mines on the beach joined the hell. The Sherman DD tanks, designed to sail on the water thanks to inflatable skirts and rear propellers, began to advance from about 4,000 meters offshore. Some sank before even arriving, swallowed by the tide and the uncertainty of the swell. Others managed to reach the sand, landing awkwardly with their canvases still deployed. One of the crew, according to the testimony of a tank sergeant, recalled how upon descending from the water they saw Canadian infantry running parallel to them, asking for cover to cross the minefields. The Royal Engineers played their most important role. Under direct fire, they cleared paths between the Belgian obstacles, those star-shaped metal structures, and minefields. They moved with mine detectors and sometimes with nothing more than a bayonet, stabbing the wet sand in search of detonators. Despite the chaos, the reports agree that Gold Beach was one of the sectors where the advance was most effective. The German defense was in charge of the 716th Infantry Regiment, a unit with second-line soldiers, many of them volunteers from Eastern Europe or older veterans. However, some positions, such as the strong point of Le Hamel, resisted fiercely. From a casemate on top of a natural elevation, an MG-42 machine gun swept the beach with crossfire. 2 Sherman tanks were hit before a British anti-tank gun, deployed on the sand itself, managed to silence it. The most disconcerting moment for many British soldiers was not the combat, but the instant after crossing the line of the beach. Behind the German defensive cordon began the rural roads of Normandy, and with them the houses, barns, and fields. As they moved inland, civilians began to appear. In the middle of the smoke and shrapnel, an elderly Frenchwoman came out of her basement with a white flag made from a sheet trembling. A farmer, with his shirt still soaked in sweat, helped load a wounded soldier onto his cart. Some accounts narrate the bewilderment of the soldiers at seeing children hidden in henhouses or entire families sheltered in the ditches along the road. There were dead horses on the side of the road, and yet the children were still there, looking at us with fear and astonishment, said a British officer. In the first hours, the front line quickly shifted inland. The British units linked up with the Canadians advancing from Juno and prepared for the later link with the American forces in Omaha. The consolidation of the D-Day objectives in gold was one of the fastest. The towns of Vers-sur-Mer, La Rivière, and Le Hamel were taken before nightfall. But not everything was success. Some areas of the terrain, especially the roads surrounded by hedgerows, the famous Norman bocage, became natural traps. The vehicles could not advance, and the German snipers, entrenched in the trees or attics, began to cause havoc. In one of the testimonies collected by John E. Lewis, a British medic recalled having to crawl for more than 100 meters to treat a young soldier, only to find him already lifeless, his gaze lost toward the apple trees of the field. The Churchill AVRE tanks, designed to demolish obstacles with their petard mortars, proved fundamental in the destruction of the concrete structures. One of these vehicles advanced almost alone until it tore down the wall of an underground shelter where a dozen Germans were hiding. According to a later report from the Royal Engineers, 3 tanks managed to demolish in Gold Beach more structures than the previous naval bombardment. Meanwhile, the rear transformed into an anthill. The beaches were now improvised hospitals, emerging cemeteries, and logistics centers. In one corner, a chaplain prayed next to a stretcher. In another, soldiers unloaded boxes of ammunition from rafts. A doctor wrote down in a notebook the names of the wounded. Another simply placed the label M on those who could no longer be saved. And among all that movement, the Norman farmers began to return to their homes. Some did it out of desperation, others out of obstinacy. A woman of about 50 years, with her blouse torn and her face full of dust, appeared before a group of Scottish soldiers and asked them not to step on her cabbage plantation. Later she offered milk to the same men. One of them said, "I did not think I would drink milk ever again after today." That was Gold Beach. Not only a military operation, but the clash of different worlds. Some came down from metal boats with rifles, others came out of basements with empty hands. The tanks swam, the mines exploded. The soldiers thought of advancing, the civilians of surviving, and it all happened among the sand, the blood, and the first flowers of June. The first hours on land, blood, mud, and disorder. When the first Allied soldiers descended from their landing craft onto the Norman coast, they did not find empty beaches nor neutral ground. In front of them rose a hell of steel, explosions, and shrapnel. Those beaches, which on the maps bore names like Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were carefully defended by German positions that had been perfected for years. For many, the landing was not a methodical military action, but a chaotic and deeply personal experience, a descent into a world of fear, mud, and death. On Omaha Beach, the panorama was especially brutal. The landing craft opened their ramps just a few meters from the water, and the men were received with bursts of MG-42 machine guns, precise and devastating. Many fell before even taking a single step outside the boat. Others tried to run forward, only to stumble on the metal obstacles driven into the sand, designed to trap tanks and vehicles. The water turned red. American soldier Charles Neighbor of the 116th Infantry Regiment would later remember that each wave seemed to bring corpses floating among the shattered equipment, ownerless boots, rifles sunk into the sand, and deformed bodies, sometimes still moving. The chaos was not only the enemy's work, Many soldiers landed outside their assigned zones, dispersing entire units and leaving officers without their men and soldiers without leadership. The maps were useless in the confusion of smoke and flames. The sound was deafening. Explosions of coastal artillery, screams of the wounded, shouted orders, and the constant hum of bullets. Some managed to shelter behind steel obstacles or craters, trembling and soaked, not knowing where to run. On Juno Beach, where the Canadians landed, the situation was different but no less bloody. The units were received by a rain of fire from fortified houses and bunkers, many of them connected by concrete trenches. In some sectors, the Canadians barely managed to advance 100 meters before being stopped. However, unlike Omaha, where commanders hesitated and reinforcements were slow to arrive, at Juno the platoons quickly found ways to regroup, to use flamethrowers and explosives to eliminate nests of resistance, and to advance inland. The fight became urban in some sectors, with house-to-house combat in the style of the ruins of Caen. The British who landed on Gold and Sword Beach faced their own challenges. On Sword, for example, the advance was initially successful, but soon they were confronted with German armoured counterattacks, especially from the 21st Panzer Division. There, the British paratroopers who had jumped the previous night held bridges and key crossroads, such as Pegasus Bridge, but they knew they would not withstand without the help of the landing troops. The tension of linking both fronts was constant. Combat engineers strove to clear routes and mines, while improvised ambulances transported the wounded without cease. The terrain, far from helping, complicated everything. The beaches were covered with craters, barbed wire, remains of anti-tank structures and bodies. The exit roads were mined, and the fields behind the beaches were a labyrinth of hedges, live fences, and Norman bocages that hindered movements. Churchill and Sherman tanks became trapped, while the Germans fired from elevated positions. But not everything was disorganization. In the midst of the chaos, acts of bravery and spontaneous leadership arose. At Omaha, Lieutenant John Spaulding gathered a scattered group of men and, without clear orders, began to climb the cliff. With grenades, rifles, and bayonets, they cleared position after position. By the end of the day, that improvised force had secured one of the key points for the exit from the beach. In another sector, Sergeant Leonard Lamel of the 2nd Ranger Battalion found the artillery pieces that the Allies feared at Pointe du Hoc, hidden among the trees far from their original positions. With only a handful of men, he disabled them with thermite explosives. The naval bombardment had missed them, but the work of the Rangers turned them into scrap. Communication was a constant problem. Radios did not work well, signals were confusing, and many platoons fought blindly, not knowing if the neighboring units had advanced or had been annihilated. On Utah Beach, however, the landing was unexpectedly smoother. The mistake of the currents led the troops to land farther south than expected, in a less defended zone. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who landed with the first group of soldiers, made the decision on the spot. "We are going to start the war from here," he said, and so it was. That quick adaptation saved many lives. During those first hours, D-Day resembled nothing of the training exercises in England. There were no marks in the sand, nor stopwatches timing the advance. Only instinct, the will to keep moving forward, and the fear of dying on the beach. The testimonies collected years later spoke of bodies torn apart by artillery, of young men without legs, of officers crying before the corpses of their men. In many units, half the soldiers did not survive the first day. In others, it was the non-commissioned officers who assumed command after the fall of the officers. As the sun rose, the coast was slowly transformed. Behind the first assaults, more and more troops began to arrive. Aid posts were set up, trenches were dug in the sand, radios were reactivated. The amphibious tanks that had managed to land began to advance inland. On Sword Beach, the Royal Engineers opened lanes through the minefields. On Juno, the Canadians approached the Bayou Road. On Omaha, still under resistance, the men began to regroup and prepare a counterattack. By midday, some units were already kilometers from the coast. Others remained trapped under fire. The tide, which was beginning to rise, carried corpses, helmets, backpacks, and parts of military equipment. It was impossible to walk without stepping on something dead or destroyed. That 6th of June, for those who survived, remained forever engraved as a mixture of confusion, mud, blood, and steel. The beaches of Normandy were an improvised cemetery, a place where war showed its most brutal and most human face at the same time. And yet it was in that very chaos where the advance that would liberate Europe was born. The struggle to survive on land, consolidating the beachheads. The heat of battle became humidity, steam, mud. It was not yet 6 in the afternoon, and many men had already spent more than 12 hours fighting, carrying ammunition, digging trenches, burying their comrades. The noise of weapons was still constant, though less chaotic than during the landing. But that rhythm, that irregular heartbeat of bursts, explosions, and screams did not announce any rest. The beachheads were taken, yes, but none were completely held, much less secured. What on the maps was called Conquered Zone was, on the ground, a collection of isolated points, small sectors of beach and fields barely cleared of enemies, where Allied soldiers fought to expand inland into Normandy. At Omaha, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Division were still facing German resistance in the cliffs and in the half-buried fortifications. By the afternoon, some paths had been opened with heavy machinery, including bulldozers launched from barges and Churchill AVRE dozer tanks that had managed to bypass enemy fire. Left behind were the bodies dissolved by coastal artillery, still floating on the water or covered with seaweed and blood on the sand. Exhausted men kept running from crater to crater while the Germans still fired from the remains of bunkers and casemates. Signals were scarce and the chain of command still diffuse. What saved the advance were the sergeants and lieutenants who took initiative, improvising tactics meter by meter. A medic of the 116th RCT would recall how he found a pair of wounded on a rural path about 100 meters from the beach, covered with blankets and barely conscious. Beside them, a small improvised cross with a bayonet stuck in the earth. They were the stragglers of a platoon that no longer existed. I never knew if they were evacuated. For us, advancing was all that mattered. On the other beaches, the panorama was only slightly more encouraging. At Utah, the beachhead was the safest of all. The 4th Division had managed to secure a wider area thanks to the German confusion caused by the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st who operated inland. Coordination with them was still minimal, but General Roosevelt Jr., who had landed with his cane in one hand and a Colt pistol in the other, toured the sectors in a jeep, giving clear orders and asserting his surname with a mix of authority and camaraderie. In his words, "There are 2 kinds of men in this place, the dead and those who are going to die. So we had better move forward." That attitude helped consolidate the sectors and organize the transfer of supplies and additional troops. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian beaches, the situation was complex. The troops had managed to overcome the coastal resistance points thanks to the more efficient use of specialized tanks such as the Hobart's Funnies, but encountered a new obstacle: time, literally. The tide had receded, leaving many vehicles trapped in wet sand. The British troops of the East Yorkshire Regiment and the Royal Marines were forced to push trucks, lift howitzers and reorganize while the evening fell. Towns such as Arromanches and Vers-sur-Mer were priority objectives, but German resistance, though disorganized, did not yield easily. In many sectors, small command posts began to rise, made with planks, sandbags, and remains of doors torn from coastal houses. Radios still did not work in most battalions. Messengers, soldiers on bicycles, or even improvisation with smoke signals and flares were used to request air support or the landing of supplies. The engineers worked without rest to extend the exits from the beaches inland. The roads were mined, sown with traps and covered with metal obstacles. Each step was a task of meticulous clearing while German snipers remained active in the trees, bell towers, wells, and grain silos. The fighting in the villages of the rear line began to be defined by a new dynamic. They were not organized attacks, but fragmented skirmishes. Each house had to be taken as if it were a fortress. The Canadian troops, for example, advanced house by house in Bernières-sur-Mer with flamethrowers and grenades. A British lieutenant would later write that it was not an invasion, but a perpetual siege of courtyards and staircases. The Germans, especially those of the 716th Infantry Division, had not yet received reinforcements, but had mined many streets and used the rubble to make each crossing an ambush. With the arrival of night, the fires of the cannons ceased only to give way to the sound of shovels. The soldiers dug defense trenches, foxholes, and shelters to await the counterattack. Many did not sleep, did not eat, and barely spoke. The medics began to establish the first evacuation posts, where the wounded piled up under stained tarps, illuminated by trembling lanterns or by the light of a dirty moon between the clouds. The prayers, the delirium, the cries of pain filled those hours where the clock seemed to have stopped in a kind of collective purgatory. Many wrote letters that night, others simply sat down, cleaned their rifle, and looked at the sea. From the horizon in the maritime rear, Operation Mulberry was already underway. In the darkness, old merchant ships were deliberately sunk to form an anti-torpedo barrier. Soon they would begin to build artificial ports to facilitate the massive landing of armored vehicles, provisions, and heavy artillery. It was a logistical operation without precedent, which even included floating gas stations, but it was still night. And for the men who slept among the bodies of their friends or shared a blanket under the charred wing of a hawser glider, the only thing that mattered was not being dragged by the tide or waking up with a bayonet in the belly. A Canadian officer of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles would later write, "That night was like no other. There was no victory nor defeat. Only a certainty we had arrived and we were not going to leave. Echoes of the storm, the weight of memory." The tide has gone out, the shots have ceased, but on the beaches where the cannons thundered, the silence also speaks. For weeks after D-Day, the Norman coast was the stage of a parade of stretchers, improvised coffins, and gravestones made with shovels stuck into the sand. The waves dragged helmets, remains of landing craft, backpacks swollen with water, and unidentified bodies. It was a post-war scene with victory not yet assured, and even so, for many, the hardest battle was only beginning. For the civilians, liberation was a chaos controlled by necessity. In Caen, Bayeux, and Saint-Lô, not one stone was left upon another. Daily life had been dismembered. Refugees returned slowly, dodging rubble and crossing fields still mined. Allied aid did arrive, yes, but the human cost became evident in the despair of the faces, in the streets that smelled of bodies buried under the debris. In the field hospitals, the combat continued, stretchers lined up, blood drying on overflowing bandages, morphine rationed with mathematical precision. British nurses spoke to Polish soldiers with soft words and universal gestures. American doctors wrote letters to the mothers of paratroopers with exposed bones. Sometimes only the hand of the dying could be held and the lie told, "We made it. Everything is all right." The cemeteries began to grow in the fields where cows once grazed, white crosses nailed in military alignment with names or without them. The ritual was always the same, some prayers, a bugle sound, and the buzz of flies. The comrades dug with more sorrow than strength. Some returned to the front without even having been able to properly look at the face of the one who had fallen at their side. In silence, they left flowers stolen from hedges for the sergeant, the radio man, the friend. In the following days, photographers and correspondents began to arrive en masse. The face of the exhausted soldier, covered with dirt and blood, appeared on the covers of London, New York, and Moscow. The stories began to leak out. The officer who cried when he saw his unit reduced to 7 men, the cook who fired until his rifle broke, the priest who gave the last rites without speaking the language of the wounded. Everything was written, filmed, kept, but the essential remained in the gazes of those who survived. In the liberated towns, the children played with shell casings, the elders waved Allied flags, and the women wove with thread donated by the Red Cross. But the shadow of the fighting was still there, among the ruins, among the night laments, among the silences of the veterans who did not want to speak. D-Day had ended, but the echo of its voices would continue to resonate for decades, on the beaches, in the documents, in the nightmares, and in the monuments where marble and memory would try in vain to contain the magnitude of the sacrifice.